When you create new projects, do you find yourself repeating the same mundane tasks over and over again? Things like adding styling libraries, adding authentication, importing third-party libraries, and just making sure that the app follows your standards? If you find yourself in this situation often, you may benefit from creating a template or a quick start application. I'm going to take you through the steps of creating a really simple Angular application that can be used as a quick start. We're going to push this to GitHub. We're going to turn that repository into a template in GitHub. And then that way you can create new projects very quickly so that you can begin doing the fun stuff. Let's get started. So before we get started, I'll show you guys the versions of Node and Angular that I'm working with. I have Angular 14, Node 16.15, and NPM 8.11. So the first thing I'll do is I'm going to use the Angular CLI to create a new project. So I'll do ng new, call it Angular template, and I'm going to add routing. And then once that's completed, I will cd into that project. The first thing I'm going to add to my project is something that I usually add to all of my projects almost right away, which is a CSS library. And I'm going to use my favorite CSS library, which is Tailwind CSS. And if you're interested in using this library or haven't seen it before, I'll put a link to it down in the description. So I'll install this with npm install -d and then Tailwind CSS, Post CSS, and Auto Prefixer. After it's installed, we need to initialize it with npx Tailwind CSS init, then check the Tailwind config file that it created to make sure that it is using the right directories for Angular. So I'll go back into VS Code, I'll go to Tailwind config.js, and in here I just want to make sure that the contents has this line. And then lastly, we need to import everything into our styles.css file. One other thing I like to add for Tailwind is the forms library. This is a library that adds some default styling for text boxes and dropdowns. And I'll also put a link to that down in the description. So back in our terminal, we will run npm install tailwind css forms. And once that's completed, we'll go back to tailwind config again. And in the plugins array, we'll make sure that it's using that forms library. So now we're all set with our CSS. Now the next thing I usually do for new projects is I set up my folder structure. And what I like to do is I like to have the following folders. I like to add a core folder. This is where I put the core services or classes for my app. And inside of the core folder, I like to add folders for guards. This is where I put all of my routing guards. Interceptors, that's for all of my HTTP interceptors. Security is where I like to put all of my authentication and authorization related services and classes. Services, now I think this is a pretty hotly debated topic on where to put services. You can put services inside of the feature module that they're being used in, but I like to keep them in the services folder and then kind of group them in subfolders according to what they're doing. This just kind of makes it a little bit easier to go straight to the services and you know that's where they're all going to be. Then lastly in core, I like to have a folder for store. Now in the store, you could put in stuff if you're using NGRX, if you're using NGXS, Akita, things like that. I generally find with the apps that I write that I don't need those tools. I actually have kind of a homegrown system that I use which uses behavior subjects and observables. So if you're interested in seeing that, hit that subscribe button because I'll be doing a video on that here in the not too distant future. And I also like to have a folder for pages. And this is where I put my components that are directly routed to. Oftentimes these are modules or feature modules, and I usually do that so that I can lazy load those features or those pages. Then I add a shared folder and a shared module. This is where I put shared components, which are then exported from this module so that they can be used by other feature modules. Now with the new version of Angular, since components can be standalone components, this isn't as big of a deal for shared components. However, it is still needed if you use third-party libraries. So this is where I like to export my third-party libraries. For example, if you use something like Clarity, PrimeNG, Angular Material, or some other library like that. So I'll go ahead and do this in the integrated VS Code terminal. The command is ng-gm-shared, so that creates a new shared module in its own folder. And the final thing that I will do for this quick demo is I'll add the files that I would normally need to deploy my projects. So I like to deploy my projects to Google Cloud Run. And if you aren't familiar with Google Cloud Run and you're interested in learning about it, I've done a couple videos, one on deploying an Angular application to Cloud Run, and another on deploying a .NET application to Cloud Run. So I'll link those here as well as down in the description. So I'm just going to copy these in from my other project. Now, since I copied these from my other project, I do need to update one small thing in my Docker file, which is the name of the output folder when this application is built. And if you created this project using the Angular CLI like I did, it should be the name that you used when you created the project. And you can also double check that by going to the angular.json file, and it will be this project name right here. Now, since Git doesn't actually commit folders, that folder structure, if there's no files inside of it, I'm going to go ahead really quick and just add a file into each one of these folders that is a file that I would normally use, and then I'll pick up from there. So now I've added all those files in. A lot of these are just dummy and test files. They're not actual files that I normally use, just for the case of this demonstration. And then I will go ahead and commit these into Git. Now the next thing we'll need to do is set up a GitHub repo to push this to. So let's go ahead and go create that. So I'm in GitHub. I will click on New Repository. For the name, I will use Angular template. I'll make it private, and I like to create my repositories empty. And the reason I do this is because the Angular CLI already creates a GitHub repo for you when you create the project. So then we can create the empty repo in GitHub and then push our existing repository into it. So then I'll click Create Repository, and on this screen, it actually shows you exactly how you can push your existing repository. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And so I'll copy these lines, and then I'll put those into our terminal and run them. So now we have all of our files pushed up to GitHub. So we can go into GitHub and look. If you refresh the code page, now you can see that all of our changes are in here. So now we have our starter application. And so we could just clone this, put it into its own folder, make the changes we need to, and use that as our new project moving forward. But GitHub has one really cool feature that makes it even easier to start new projects. So you can tell GitHub to use this as a template, and then that lets you create new templates or new repositories with just a couple clicks. So let's go set that up. We're in our repo, and if we go to settings, you can see right here that there's a checkbox for template repository. If you check that, that's it. That's literally all you have to do. So now you can create a brand new project with all of those files and not have to go through all of the time of setting up all of that boilerplate starter code, and you're all ready to go and start your project and start coding. To show you how this works, if you go back to the code page again, now there's a button here that says use this template. So if you click that, you can see it's creating a new repository and it's using that repository as a template. So I will create a new repository here, and I'm just going to call it template demo. I'll leave it as public. I'll go ahead and say include all branches. You can actually just not check that and it'll only check out the main branch. Or if you want to have all of the branches, you can include all of them and then click create. It'll take a couple seconds for it to create it for you. And now you're done. So now if you want to, you can literally come up here, you can clone this, and your new project is ready to go. So just like that, you're off to the races and you can begin creating new applications very quickly. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.